So while we're doing this, just to introduce ourselves, and thank you ever so much. We're following an absolute tour de force in terms of a presentation. So I'm Nancy Redfern, and I'm an anaesthetist in Newcastle. And Emma and I are the co-chairs of, and it's the Association of Anaesthetists, mostly, not the Royal College, although the Royal College are very much involved, and the Faculty of Intensive Care Medicine working group. And we're just going to share some of our experiences and thoughts. And then Emma.
Yes, hello everyone. So my name is Emma. I'm a consultant anaesthetist in Birmingham. Yeah, Nancy and I have been working together for 7 or 8 years on this now. So yeah, delighted to share our thoughts, and we've had much wisdom already from Bernadette. Hopefully we'll kind of expand on what she's been saying. Can you see the slides okay, Nancy?
Yeah.
Can you see them?
Yeah. So, so we're on to the second slide, are we? Hasn't moved on my thing. Yeah. So what we're going to do today is to think a little bit about what fatigue is, but I think Bernadette's already explained some of that, so we might slip over fairly quickly. We've heard some of the causes, and yes, you know, very important, the pressure that we feel, financial pressure, the sort of the biopsychosocial models that Bernadette's been speaking about. Some of the things about the impact both on us, lots of health issues, and on patient safety. And then think about how we manage this as individuals and how we move towards a system that manages it, with both the department and the organisation and the rota people understanding and doing this effectively. And then to sort of share some of our experiences of trying to make change in this area. We're very much on a journey. You know, as Emma said, we started about 7 years ago, and actually what brought me into it was a conversation with somebody who chaired the national group of trainees in anaesthesia, membership of about 3,000, and I just asked him, as you do in general conversation, what sort of week he'd had. He'd spoken at his colleague's funeral. This colleague was a lovely chap. He'd done 3 12-hour night shifts at the Norfolk Norwich and was just driving home to Cambridge, which he'd done lots of times before. There was a bed to sleep in, but he just had enough, wanted to get in the car and wound the window down, put his phone on loudspeaking. He knew what to do. And then this happened. Next slide. So that was a personal tragedy. His wife was a widow when she gave birth, and that child's never met Dad. But I was the membership secretary at the Association of Anaesthetists at the time, and this seemed to me to be a completely unnecessary death. Something had to be done. And as we started to read around the subject, it was clear that Ronnie wasn't the only health service worker to die driving home. And if we put some slides up, you can see doctors, nurses. It happened to somebody every couple of years. And some of these, you know, the Yorkshire and Humber, both of these last two, Johnny Ball died. He at 2:30 in the morning crashed into a milk, I think it was a dustbin lorry, and this is a lovely nurse from Wakefield who died. Just microsleep at a roundabout and died. I think there might be one other person, because there was a chap, Joel Manor-Lyle, died driving from Blackpool, driving from Lancaster to Blackpool. So we could see that a group of us got together as a joint working group, again, as I say, as the Royal College, the Faculty of Intensive Care, and the Association of Anaesthetists. And we needed to find out how common fatigue was. So next slide. So we started by doing a survey of trainees in anaesthesia in the UK. And of course, as soon as we published the survey of trainees, the consultants said, me too. So of course we surveyed both. So between the two, we've had over 5,000 responses. So it was a big issue even before the pandemic. And you can see here that 57% of trainees and 45% of consultants described having an accident or near miss driving post nights or after a long day. 3/4 commute by car or motorbike, and 84% of the trainees at that time described having felt too tired to drive, but quite a lot of people doing it anyway, because at that time there were no rest facilities for them when they're on call. And later, a colleague, an occupational physician, in fact, surveyed the nurses and midwives in the hospital I work in Newcastle. And you see, she got similar results, with 45% of them describing an accident or near miss. So it isn't about being an anaesthetist, it's about being a human. So next slide then. So I kind of described what motivated us to address this in the UK. We then had to think, right, okay, we've got a problem here. How do we influence change? How do we mitigate these effects in our own department when we're working long hours and night shifts? And changing the way we do things is hard for all of us. We've all got loads of ideas floating around the back of our brains, but it's really only when we get a sense of urgency that we put energy into changing. And of course, for us, that sense of urgency came with Ronnie's death. And once we've decided change is needed, we start and look for remedies and realise some of them will work and some perhaps won't. And the decision to act is actually both intellectual and emotional. And we too read Thinking Fast and Slow and Matthew Walker's book. And we're trying to think, how do we go about this? So over to Emma.
Thanks, Nancy. So I'm going to just cover some of the facts around fatigue for the next kind of few slides. And this is the sort of information that we talk about when we're doing education sessions with healthcare staff. So I've just pulled out some that we use, and some of which obviously Bernadette has mentioned already. So I find this kind of flow sheet quite helpful in kind of understanding the impacts of fatigue. So fatigue is more than tiredness. So tiredness is kind of like a weariness after work. We often think of it as kind of sleepiness and an increased need for sleep. And normally that's relieved by rest. And when we don't get enough rest, then we become fatigued. And fatigue is when it impacts on our performance. So we're starting to, it may be our physical performance, it may be our kind of psychological performance that is affected. And then when fatigue is prolonged, exacerbated, not managed, then it leads to exhaustion. And exhaustion is when there is physical and emotional harm and we're unable to respond anymore to the physical and emotional stresses that we're facing. And I read once that we can think of fatigue as a kind of warning sign on our body. So it's telling us that we need to do something differently. And maybe we need to adjust our sleeping pattern and get more sleep. Maybe we need to rest if we've had a long shift or it's the middle of the day and we're tired from decision making. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Then maybe we need to get outside and, take a break, have something to eat and drink. So it's a useful sign if we listen to it and we don't just continue to push on through. So what causes fatigue then? And Bernadette has mentioned any of these, and I think I need a fifth actually to recognise the impact of chronic health actually on fatigue. So fatigue can be caused by chronic sleep restriction, which is remarkably easy to accumulate if you don't get your adequate amount of sleep. It can be caused by acute sleep deprivation, by night working and trying to work when your body is telling you should be asleep, and then also by high intensity work. And these you can see in healthcare workers that all four of these combine. And then, as we heard, obviously lack of sleep can impact on the presence of chronic health conditions, which can further compound this. So as healthcare workers, we are very much at high risk of fatigue. So these are the factors that kind of impact on how fatigued we are. So the time that we've spent asleep, first of all. So you will know this already, but learning this in this work just reminded me that actually we all need, I think you're more likely, in Matthew Walker's book, he says you're more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to be someone who can actually manage on less than 7 to 8 hours sleep a night. You just get more fatigued and forget what it's like to feel normal. And if you just decrease the amount of sleep that you're getting just by a couple of hours a night, you can very quickly accumulate a sleep debt. And before long, it's equivalent to having one night of no sleep at all. The other point to mention is that actually, you know, when we're working long shift patterns, you may get a decent break, but actually by the time you've got home, you've cooked some food, you've done all those things you need to do, actually it can be really hard to just prioritize getting the amount of sleep. And I think I would argue that even outside kind of shift working patterns and working nights, you know, we're probably already sleep deprived. And actually there's some data from kind of the national surveys on kind of sleep that would kind of suggest this. It's also impacted on the time we spent awake. So the longer we are awake, the more impact that has on our health. And as I transitioned from trainee to consultant, I started doing a day's work, and then I will start my on-call shift at 5 or 6 in the evening, and then I will get on with the on-call work. And if it's busy, then suddenly you find that you've actually been awake and concentrating in work for a long period of time, and actually trying to be mindful about, you know, what that will have done to your performance. And, you know, once you've been awake for over 20 hours, then this is similar to it, you know, comparable effects on your performance to being over the legal limit for drink driving. And we know from data in kind of other industries that after an 8-hour shift, the accident risk starts to increase almost exponentially, you know, between 8 and 12 hours at work. So I think the kind of fewer longer shifts are good from a lifestyle point of view if you want more time off to rest. But I completely agree with the comments earlier about the fact that then people are often trying to kind of make up for the, you know, earn more money and take on additional shifts. So we really need to be mindful of this. The time of day also impacts. Now, we're probably all right still around lunchtime, but this afternoon, most of us will feel a kind of dip in our performance as our circadian physiology picks in. We'll become a little bit more awake around 5 or 6 in the evening, and then our, you know, sleepiness drops off. And it's really just a reminder that, you know, in the middle of the night, that 3-4 o'clock time, it's not normal to be awake. However good we are at adjusting our body clock, we will not be performing as at our best. And it, you know, it is like working when jet lagged, and yet we are expecting our staff to do it, and then we're wondering why, you know, it's more difficult to do those complex tasks and make decisions and communicate well when people are very tired. We've heard a little bit about this already, but just to kind of remind ourselves of the impact this has. So it's, you know, I see the junior doctors handing over the other morning, you know, and they find it difficult to get their kind of words out. You know, it's very much harder to be kind of empathetic with patients, to make kind of reasoned decisions. Your vigilance and flexibility goes, and you can, you know, Mike Fokker did a lovely experiment with people's blowing up balloons and the risks they would take at the end of a shift, showing that actually, you know, it's been linked to making more risky decisions. It's more difficult to remember things, psychomotor skills are kind of impacted. So there's lots of reasons why fatigue impacts our performance. And we've heard already about the impacts on our personal health. This is a really interesting study done on healthy volunteers, which is a really stark reminder of how we lose the insight into sleep deprivation on our performance. So the graph on the left is of performance. It's psychomotor vigilance test lapses with increasingly restricted sleep. So the black squares are people who've had no sleep at all. So these are healthy volunteers who'd had normal sleep before this, and then this is with 3 days of no sleep. And you can see this is a kind of increased lapses in performance. As you restrict the sleep, so 6 hours, 4 hours, so they've had 4 hours sleep on the middle line, the circles, 6 hours sleep, and then they've had a normal amount of sleep with a kind of lower line, and they've got really good kind of performance levels. And then the graph on the right hand side is how people rate their performance, so their subjective assessment of their sleepiness. And you can see that everybody who had no sleep, there's quite a good match there, that you realise when you've had no sleep at all that your performance is affected. But actually, when you've had 4 or 6 hours sleep, you're actually thinking that your performance really isn't too bad, when actually the graph on the left-hand side would suggest it has been affected. So this kind of just demonstrates quite nicely through experiments that actually we lose that insight into the impact of fatigue on our performance. Decision fatigue, I think, is worth mentioning because not all healthcare workers work shifts, but actually we often work without breaks, and we have long periods of time where we're expected to make decisions, you know, and we often forego breaks because there's so much work to do. And there's been a few studies that, well, there's been quite a bit of work done on this idea about decision fatigue, when it gets increasingly hard to make decisions a long period of time after a long period of decision making. And I see this, I always say this, I do a pre-op clinic and I get piles of notes. I see my patients and then I have lots of note reviews to do. And I fully recognise that actually I find it harder and harder to make decisions. And if I just go away and come back the next morning and look at stuff, I'm much better at making the decisions kind of objectively. So, and you can see that actually interestingly here, the decisions tend to be more conservative actually. So people maybe recognise that they're taking the kind of conservative option, so more likely to refer for a second opinion, which has real resource implications actually, you know, because it's longer since a break. So just a little bit of summary here, and you'll get these slides. So this is more for kind of information. You can see one of the infographics that we've produced, or fact sheets that we've produced through our work, just that we've sent round to departments to put them in their department to give people some of the facts around sleep. And the kind of slightly depressing news is that some people find that as you get older, you need less. There was that rumour, wasn't there, that you need less sleep, but actually I think it's just that you find it harder to get the restorative sleep. And I've done it's a separate talk really to talk about fatigue and sleep. So what can we do about it? So I'm going to just whiz through some slides about what we can do as individuals, and then Nancy's going to talk about what we can do in our systems, and she's done a lot of great work in Newcastle around, and they have actually got a fatigue policy there, so she'll share some insights around that. So this is our remedies that we looked at. These are all the sorts of things that we've been kind of trying to work on around improving the culture around fatigue management, and it's moving people from knowing about this, and so a lot of it is starting with education, to actually wanting to do something differently, to kind of change our working environment. So I'm going to talk about some of the resources that we've used and just kind of hopefully inform you, so that then you can kind of think about how you can share the learning with others as well. So these are the sorts of things that we can do as individuals. We can practice good sleep hygiene when we have control over our sleep. So sometimes our shift pattern doesn't allow us, but when we can. We also need to kind of recognise ourselves and actually what works for us, and to kind of think about how we can prioritise sleep when we can. And then it's also about, we have a role as an individual, but also as a colleague, to kind of support our colleagues to do the same. So some of the things we talk about with sleep hygiene, and this is another one of our infographics, is thinking about our blue light exposure and electronic device use overnight. A lot of them now have the settings to kind of turn down the blue light that's emitted. So blue light suppresses your melatonin release. So therefore you won't release melatonin, and the quality of your sleep will reduce if you're looking at a screen before bedtime. It also, screens often stimulate us to kind of think about stuff. So actually putting devices away kind of can help with that side of things. But I recognise it's hard in our kind of busy lives. We'll sleep better if our room is dark, if it's quiet, and if our bed is comfortable and warm, but our room is cold. And the old advice of having a bath before bed actually has some physiological kind of science behind it. So as I understand it, that promotes vasodilatation, and then our body temperature drops a little bit, which can promote kind of sleepiness. And actually thinking about ways to kind of switch off, and you know, using a to-do list, doing a bit of yoga, using a meditation app, all of those things to help promote good quality sleep when we can. And I think this is something, you know, we don't talk a lot about sleep for a medical school. Actually, we don't talk about it for our patients in hospitals. So my dad had a hip replacement this week, and the first night after his operation, he had those squeezy boots on, the Flowtron boots, and that didn't keep him awake, but they beeped every half an hour. So every time he thought he was dropping off to sleep, he was woken up. And actually, that's just at the point when he kind of needs really good quality sleep. So you need to think about knowing how much sleep we need. What is our optimum? Are we a natural kind of lark or an owl? And there is a little bit of evidence around that. So thinking about whether we're someone who actually would do better going to bed early, getting up early where we can, or if we work kind of better in the evenings and actually kind of lie in. And we are all different, and not everyone can sleep for 8 hours straight, but we need to kind of know ourselves and work out what works for us. And I've said this already, prioritize your sleep when you can. It's not like to try not to let all of this work induce anxiety, because there's nothing worse, I think, than thinking, you know, I really must sleep. It's kind of something that triggers insomnia, I think, and makes it even harder. And I've had periods of insomnia which you know are really can be really quite distressing, but actually to prioritize it when you can. Getting into the nitty-gritty of working at night, I think this is really important, and I do talk to all of the junior doctors in my organisation about how to work well at night. So there's about preparing for your night shifts and actually thinking about so it's about preparing before you come to work even, and perhaps banking a little bit of extra sleep, so having a lie-in before your shift, or ideally having a sleep in the afternoon before you come to work, so that if you're driving home the next morning, actually you haven't been up for over 24 hours before you get in your car. Can you have a lie-in? Can you have some sleep in the afternoon? And just thinking about, is it possible for you to kind of travel to and from work a different way? Because we know that when we're tired, we're going to use our automatic decision making, and we're just going to default to getting in our car if that's how we plan to get home. And being aware of the 4 a.m. dip, I've talked about this already, and then thinking about, you know, those moments in the shift when we're likely to be particularly fatigued. So the wording around power naps came from pilots in the airline industry, actually, that it was felt to be like a prophylactic nap, wasn't felt to be very encouraging, not very macho perhaps, and actually this idea of a power nap was introduced. And actually there was evidence that shows that if you take a preventative nap early in the shift, it reduced the number of microsleep. So a microsleep is what's caused a lot of the accidents. So it's just sudden, unexpected period of sleep. But actually, if you've had a preventative nap, actually, that's much less likely towards the end of your shift. You only need a short nap, but you do need to factor in a little bit of time to fall asleep. And if you are, I think I've only ever managed to do this once, was to have a cup of coffee and then have a nap. And then the caffeine will be kicking in as you wake up. But, you know, this again is about knowing what you need. And even if you can't sleep, just having a period of kind of downtime where you're not stimulated and your brain has a rest is kind of really important. So between shifts, actually, it's a thinking about, and I tell all the junior doctors, don't schedule things in between your shifts, don't schedule deliveries, go to bed as soon as you can when you get home, because sometimes you sleep early in the morning and then you might wake up a little bit hungry, or just naturally make up in the middle of the day. And if you already have some sleep, then you can get up for a bit if you need to, then try and sleep again. So try and maximise the amount of sleep you can get between your shifts. So it's about going to bed early and then kind of sleeping for as long as you can. And then when you're thinking about recovering after night shifts, it's about sleeping early in the morning to then restore your normal body clock kind of as quickly as possible. And you will need a couple of nights. So these are the sorts of things that I think every kind of healthcare worker needs to be told when they're kind of starting working shifts. And this is what we've been trying to work on promoting. And then I think the other thing we can do, as I said, is kind of supporting our colleagues. And there's this kind of idea of priming, and the way you ask a question, you know, have you had a power nap, rather than kind of how are you going to get home, which kind of suggests that people are just going to get in their car and drive. And there's this whole idea. So there's a lovely example, and Nancy probably can explain it better, but there's you know, even images can kind of prime how you kind of behave, and actually you see images of a kind of calm, slower environment, and actually you would end up kind of walking more slowly from room to room and things. So, you know, the questions that we get asked really influence our behaviour. So it's about, you know, you look tired, have you had a nap? You know, are you, you know, think about the way that questions are asked. And I think the other thing to mention is that we need a supportive culture. And one of the things that we talked about was kind of we've devised some standards for rest facilities for for rest facilities and rest culture for organisations, and then also some individual responsibilities. And it's all very well kind of having somewhere to rest, but if you're in a culture that says that, you know, you'll be disciplined for resting and doesn't encourage it, then you can't get that rest. So we need organisations to support their staff to get their kind of rests on shifts, and culture is, as we know, you know, talking to, you know, the importance of kind of safety culture and a supportive work culture is really key to all of this. I'm going to hand back to Nancy, but I'm going to keep controlling the slides. So Nancy, tell me what I need to do. We're going to think a little bit more about fatigue in as a kind of systems and an organisational approach.
Yeah, so yes, if we go on to the next slide. Yeah, so what we've done where I work is we've put these posters up everywhere. So that's them in the in the ladies' changing room, and one on the back of the loo door. Press the next button. We realised that half the people weren't reading them, so we needed to adjust the height and put them at the right place. Next slide. So what we found out about, we got ourselves the educational material. The next thing was the rest facilities, and to make sure that there are some rest facilities. And I can't remember if the next slide's got a picture. Lots of hospitals have sofa beds or sleep pods. And the Royal College agreed a set of standards for facilities. And I think if you press the button, that might come up. And that standard is now used when it does an assessment of the department. And also, one of our colleagues has designed a really brilliant audit tool, and you can see how well departments are doing to meet this. We were talking about it yesterday, and it looks like actually at the moment there's only 10% of departments that are in the red. There is a fatigue assessment tool that individuals can use. There's the Samparelli, there's the Epson, there's the Karolinska. So there's lots of things that can be done, but you can't really impose this on departments. Different people work differently. So we've taken a very multifaceted approach. We don't really know what's going to work where, but we just try what we can. So we do lots of talks. We, invite us and we'll come and talk to your department. But really bigger cultural change needed the working group and the Fight Fatigue campaign. And it's that's really started to attract people outside our specialty. And it really wasn't until we introduced the Fight Fatigue campaign that how important that was for things like speaking to politicians and others. And the General Medical Council, which is the UK regulator, now has questions both in the trainee and the trainer survey that relate to this. So next slide. So it kind of dawned on me that as I was doing lots of national speaking, things weren't right in my own department. So we secured some research funding, and guided by the academics that I work with from Northumbria, we got the labour ward team, nurses, doctors, midwives, healthcare assistants, to identify ways that were going to prevent the team members getting too tired, and to try and support each other, like Emma was saying, when we're critically tired. Drew Dawson's editorial, I think, is very good, and he pointed out that the likelihood of us implementing the sort of solutions that are used in other safety critical industries, because every other safety critical industry has a regulatory requirement for us to have breaks and to stop things. You know, you don't get on a flight with a tired pilot, but you can get an operation from a tired anaesthetist and surgeon. And he talks about the fact that more people on the rota, better rotas, more breaks, compulsory rest periods, the chance of these being adopted is close to zero in the healthcare environment. So we need to find other ways of doing things. So next slide then, thanks. So using that idea that he talks about, that the fatigue is influenced by the sort of frequency, the duration, the intensity of the work, the individual clinicians' experience and the level of supervision, we started to use these principles to design. And again, I got this template from an occupational physician in Dublin, predictive, proactive and reactive elements like they have in other industries. So we bought sofas. I think there's a slide of that. Yeah, so that's what we're trying to use. So keep going, press a bit more. We've got this, which is a Fitbit that connects to an app on the phone. So green, you're fine. Yellow, orange, yellow, you're between 2 and 5 times more likely to crash your lorry, and red, you're more than 5 times more likely to crash. And here's a comment from a midwife, and you could see how she recognised that actually this business of just not accepting I don't get much sleep between night shifts, she could do something about it, and she really takes that much more seriously. So we change timing of induction, so we do fewer cesarean sections in the middle of the night. The midwives use self-rostering, so each person can choose how many nights they work, which then fits more with their own circadian rhythm and sleep. And we kind of recognise it now as part of what we do. Next slide then, thanks. This is a study done by Geiger Brown. Just to do a couple of seconds of explanation. On the top of both graphs, you see arrows going down. That is the homeostatic mechanisms that make us sleepy. And all the while we're awake, our brain releases substances called somnogens. Adenosine is a very good somnogen, and that just makes us more and more sleepy. Caffeine works because it's an adenosine blocker. Counteracting that, on the bottom half of each graph, you can see the circadian alerting signal, which just keeps us awake. So our sort of wake propensity, our ability to stay awake, is pretty good going through the day, because the circadian alerting signal counteracts the somnogens. But then when it goes dark, we've got no circadian alerting signal. So of course that stops and the somnogens win and we go to sleep. Now, this study was done by a Professor Geiger Brown in Wisconsin, and she got all two groups of 6 teams of nurses, and the bottom lot got a 30-minute power nap. And the bottom line was they were more empathic, more awake, made fewer drug errors, and were safer driving home. But the problem she had was recruiting. Some of the people, even though this was safer for patients, they just thought it was unprofessional to be asleep at night when you're being paid. And so what they've ended up doing was the American Academy of Nursing changed their advice so that people are now advised to sleep, to have a power nap at night. The next slide. So many of us who work at night kind of know the difference between work as done and what we tell our managers and what they imagine goes on at night. And work done might involve a completely hectic night where we've got no chance of a break, or working in a team that makes sure we get a powered nap, or sneaking off ourselves for a quiet kip when we think that the powers be won't notice. And so on some nights we might disclose we've had a nap, others we know it's wisest not to. Seniors who describe what's going on in their organisation or their team who don't themselves work at night might say, oh yes, fatigue's all sorted out, everyone always gets a break, they're prioritised. But of course we all know that that's not really true. And the more we can design what's needed based on human physiology, the nearer we can get these 4 ovals: work as imagined, work as prescribed, work as done, and work as disclosed, to come together, then the safer our system will be. Next slide then. So we've found out about fatigue assessment. tools and the things we can use. We've thought about the way we can move people from knowing how to sort of embedding things, and then eventually having a joint statement, and then moving towards the bigger cultural change that we need so that we actually do make a difference. So next slide. So once we got the publication, we started by going and seeing some ministers, and there's a picture here on the bottom left of Ruma Crossan, my colleague who is also on the extreme left, advising the Scottish Government, and then there's me meeting a minister, a man from the DUP, and us meeting an ex-Minister of Health. So we were trying to just make a little bit of inroad, and if you press the button, so it became Scottish Government policy, and next one, and we did win an award for it. So that was a little bit of sort of positive getting somewhere. Next. Oh, and here we are in Parliament. We had a parliamentary reception, which actually you think, oh, what's that about? But actually, it was really useful. The next slide, then. So now, thinking about putting a fatigue risk management policy into practice and capturing fatigue in the safety incident reporting, identifying what we're going to do, and really in my own hospital actually trying to change the culture. So what we did, there are lots of small studies about clinical performance, and what we did was we just asked the nurses and the midwives and the doctors and everybody who's filling in these DATEX forms, well, what do you think? And these are just the reports from people who have self-reported and where the assessor has said, yes, I agree. And we get 24,000 reports a year, and about 5% of them mention fatigue. I was quite proud of this, and I told the man from the Rail Accident Investigation Branch, 5% of and he said, and what about the other 20%? All the other safety critical industries recognise that it should be about 25%. And you can see here that the wrong drug, wrong dose, wrong site, medication errors, that's logical reasoning and vigilance errors, they're pretty common. Communication's pretty common. Calculations of the right dose in the middle of the night's really hard. Next slide then, thanks. So there we are, 24,000, lots of them. So what sort of things do people report? Well, we had a report from a midwife whose childcare had broken down, and she'd come to work, and the patient complained that she was Mrs. Grumpy all night. I mean, she was just trying to stay awake, to be honest. But they recognised that was what was wrong. People, as Emma has said, people they decide what they're going to do, and they just go on and do it without thinking about, is this the right thing to do? Are they analysing the risk of taking this patient to theatre now? Their logical reasoning is poor, their flexibility. You do need intellectual flexibility to run a fast-changing environment at night. Another slide. This is about psychomotor skills. In our labour ward, the chance of an inadvertent dural puncture from an epidural where a patient gets a bad headache afterwards, which is pretty gruesome when you've just had a baby, is 0.8% between 7 a.m. and 3 a.m. And then between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. it's 3%, which is almost 4 times as much. And it's because your psychomotor skills are less good. I had a very florid description in a thing we did in Europe, because I'm on the European board as well, of the dreadfulness of trying to work out what to do when you've got a guide wire stuck of somebody at 4 in the morning. Another one I think there is, this is an awful vigilance thing where somebody was monitoring ECGs and they missed a critical rhythm problem and the patient arrested. And then I think there's another one which is, we had a problem where right at the end of the night shift, nurses moving a bed and they caught a chest drain, and the patient got a tension pneumothorax. So real things going wrong, which are really kind of important. So these are evidence of the sort of degradation in cognitive performance, slow response time, increased lapse of inattention, not being able to swap around things and not being able to kind of recall and apply and solve information. That just get on with it. Immoral, impulsive people are much more likely to adopt strategies that prioritize short-term gain over the long-term sensible thing to do. The impacts on emotional, feeling more negative at night, anxiety and all that sort of thing, and difficulty in coping and demonstrating empathy, poorer ability to self-regulate. So all our data, and we've only got 1 year, all of that sort of thing is there. Next slide then, thanks. So having done the project in the labour ward, we then took it out to other places. Anybody who was interested, come and we did a workshop, and we got loads of little ideas. Changing the medication time, so it's not midnight and 6 a.m, it's 1 a.m and 7 a.m, because 7 a.m is outside the circadian nadir. So lots and lots of different ideas. Next slide then, thanks. But the real change for us was getting a group together to improve management of fatigue in the hospital. And the chair, the manager, he'd once been in the forces, and he knew, he'd got some lurid descriptions of I think one of his colleagues had parked a chieftain tank in somebody's on somebody's front lawn by mistake, with a micro sleep. So he really knew what it was about. And it really it's played a part in he's written a fatigue risk management document, so that we've got standards and expectations and data collection and responding systems and what have you. Next slide, thanks. So it's about culture change. And by working with each department and co-designing, so that we don't come and tell you what to do, we come and tell you what the problem is and see what people think. And working in a co-design, people design their own approach to fatigue, and then that automatically gets put into place when they're working at night, and they feel empowered and supported, and there's more networking between different people trying things out, and more engagement in this being a good idea and doing it well. So next slide. So that's our fatigue risk management strategy there, and that's one of the things that just a diagram from it. So next slide. So there we are. That's some of what we've been doing. So this is a QR code if you happen to fancy those. The infographics, and there's some talks and other bits and pieces on there, but delighted to take questions and see what you think.
Yeah, has anybody got any questions? I know what I stuck in my mind is thinking about, thank you both for that, it's really good. Mobile phones using as alarm clocks. I'm a bit stuck with that one, because I almost don't trust my alarm clock now. You got a bit of a friendship with your phone, don't you?
I use my watch actually, but yeah.
Oh, do you?
So yeah, but old school alarm clock, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
But I mean, there's loads in your presentation now. Yeah, my mind's buzzing. I'll have to go back over your presentation. Has anyone got any questions from our team as well? Anyone at all? Rachel?
Yes, I've got a question. I'm very interested in fatigue for personal reasons, neurological fatigue specifically because of a brain injury. And I support fatigue management courses for people with neurological fatigue. One thing I'm really interested in is the issue of like power naps, and that how to persuade people, individuals, or their line managers or whatever, that having a short nap can be a really positive, a really constructive thing to do, rather than being a sign of weakness or a sign of laziness. And I just imagine that within a healthcare setting, when there's numerous other pressures on people, how have you overcome that challenge?
Well, if I can go perhaps first, because I think we're getting there. When we did the study I described on the labour ward, we got 3 sofas that turned into beds, and we really encouraged the midwives to have a power nap at night. And that slide that I showed from Geiger Brown in Wisconsin, where they had half the teams having no power nap and half the teams having a half-hour power nap, and that because those people were safer and made fewer drug errors, you can't deny patient safety. So that's why we are collecting data about when a nurse, when a doctor, when a midwife, when a healthcare assistant thinks something has gone wrong and fatigue has played a part. As soon as somebody says, oh, well, it might have played a part, then you go to all the other airline, petrochemical, nuclear, maritime, and they all recommend power naps. So the question to me, when somebody doesn't recommend a power nap, is why they think it's better to have an unsafe service. And I would be interested to know what the reply your people would give to that. What do you think they'd say, Rachel?
I don't know, because I'm working with people who have had a brain injury, so it's they're kind of dealing with other issues. But I think what you've said is really interesting. It is so important to have that data to support it. And I suppose I'm thinking people are normally trying to persuade their relatives that they're not being lazy when they say they have to have a sleep. So it's different because it's within a sort of domestic setting. But I think what you've said is that issue of having the data, because I think there is something inherently, that is culturally embedded within us and our sort of professional cultures, that you should still fight the fatigue and fight through and push on. And I think, yes, as you said, turning the argument round is very clever, but having data to support that.
Well, you see, the airline industry have got loads of evidence of what happened when pilots fought through it, and lots of dead people. I can't see that's a benefit. I don't think any of those doctors and nurses that I put slides on have died. I don't think that is a benefit to the health service.
I think some people need the data, don't they? They need to see it in the numbers, and having that incident report, the incident reports where people have said, yes, fatigue affected it. And sometimes you can give them the information we've given, and they'll go, yes, that makes sense to me, therefore we'll change. People need different, and sometimes people need an emotional story. Like for the anaesthetic community, I think that the death of a trainee driving home was, and it was people understood that, and the number of people who reported having accidents driving home, therefore how are they safe to work? How are they not really, really tired the hour, 2 hours before that in their shift? Do you know what I mean? So I think we had that kind of help to raise awareness.
We just got a couple more minutes left before we wrap up, so you can always put your questions in the chat, but Anne, do you want to go for it?
Oh, okay then. I just wanted to wholeheartedly support what you were saying about having the data, because in the world outside the NHS, there's a lot of hubris about being tough. As Rachel said, about you've got to fight it, you've got to get through, and you almost brag that you can manage without sleep, and to have data to undercut that. And I was thinking of Bernadette, who quoted a number of studies and experts as she spoke. I mean, it was very refreshing to me, because I've always believed in the need for sleep, and I've quite come up against it in sort of stating my own needs. So yeah, I think data and expertise in the area, and a lot of publicity outside the NHS, because the culture isn't quite there. Maybe the NHS will be the leader on it.
Yes. And just to say that the HSSIB are now put a call out for evidence about fatigue and its impacts, both from patients and staff. So we can send you the link to that, but we've been working behind the scenes with them and Mike Farker and people for almost a year to get to a point where they now see that they need to do and they've started an investigation.
Yes. The other thing to mention actually is, just as Bernadette said, we need to manage fatigue better in healthcare. That's what this is all about, finding ways to managing it. And I think previously it's been put in a too difficult box, so we've pretended it's not happening. And we've been working with the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors, and they're just putting out a white paper around fatigue risk management in healthcare, where they've taken expertise and advice from other industries to kind of put together some they've got some little vignettes in it, and actually started to put together the case, for it coming from outside healthcare. These are ergonomists kind of now recognizing this, so that's worth looking out for. Hopefully that will sometimes people need to hear it from different sources, don't they? They don't necessarily hear it. It doesn't land the right way from the healthcare workers. It needs to come from outside. So hopefully this will give some credibility to this. Not that it should need that, but yeah.
Yes. And may I just add, I think awareness needs raising, not just in healthcare, but in the whole of society. And it was frustrating that the Green Paper on health, whereas it's focused so much on nutrition and exercise that we know so much about, there was only a small paragraph on sleep. And the Society of Public Health made an objection to this, and I believe they've been asked to progress research further into it, but they do publish some great guidance on the health benefits of sleep for the general public, and also training for NHS staff. Don't snooze on your don't press the snooze button on your health.